What if I told you that being attractive during ancient warfare was actually a death sentence? Today, we're diving into the brutal reality that nobody talks about. And trust me, it's way darker than you think. Let me paint you a picture that's going to make you question everything you thought you knew about ancient warfare. You're a soldier in your 30s. You've been fighting wars for what feels like forever. Every single day you're surrounded by nothing but rough battle, hardened men, constant violence, blood, sweat, and the stench of death. Your commander feeds you empty promises about glory and honor, while you're eating stale bread that's harder than rocks and looking at dead grass for miles and miles. You're in the middle of absolute nowhere, so isolated from civilization that you don't even need to hide when nature calls. Your life has become this endless cycle of march, fight, sleep, repeat. You haven't seen a proper bed in months. You haven't had a decent meal in weeks. And you definitely haven't seen a woman in so long that you're starting to forget what they look like. The only faces you see are scarred, bearded, and usually covered in someone else's blood. Then one day, your commander gives the order that changes everything. Take the city. Leave no survivors. Now here's where it gets interesting. What do you think a soldier's first instinct is when he hears those words? Murder. Revenge. Wrong. It's treasure hunting. You've been living like an animal for months, surviving on scraps, sleeping on the ground, and now you finally have a chance to grab something valuable. Sure, you can't touch the wealthy families. That's reserved for the officers. They get first pick of everything valuable, but regular folks, common people, they're fair game for soldiers like you. You've earned this, you've bled for this, you've watched your friends die for this moment. You kick down the door of a simple house, expecting to find gold, silver, maybe some decent food. But instead you discover something that's been hidden under the kitchen stove, a local woman. She's trembling, obviously terrified, covered in soot and dirt from hiding. She's not nobility, just a farmer's wife. Probably spent her whole life working the fields, but after years of military life, after years of temporary encounters in questionable establishments, there's something about the idea of having someone waiting at home that hits completely different. The woman drops to her knees, her voice shaking as she tells you her husband died in battle. Says there's nothing valuable in the house. They already took everything when the siege started. But if you spare her life, she'll stay with you. She'll do whatever you want. You think about it. The army's going to be stationed here for days anyway. Maybe you could talk to your superior. Pretend to be on patrol duty. Finally experience what a peaceful life feels like. But here's where the story takes a turn that'll blow your mind. You approach your commanding officer with this request, and this old veteran, this guy who's been fighting wars since before you were born, sees right through you immediately. He's not angry though. Instead, he starts laughing, tells you to bring the woman to a specific house, mentions that other soldiers have made similar arrangements, says it's actually better when everyone has something to lose. Mutual secrets make for loyal soldiers. You bring the woman to the designated location, but when you arrive, you realize there's a separate tent in the military camp. And what you see inside makes your blood run cold. It's filled with captured women from wealthy families, daughters of merchants, wives of nobles, and several high-ranking officers in shining armor are walking around, selecting the most attractive ones for themselves. Layer by layer, they're making their choices like they're shopping at a market. Fortunately, your woman looks rather plain, weathered from years of farm work, her hands rough from labor, so the officers aren't interested in her. Your commander lets you keep her. But here's the thing about having brothers in arms. Not everyone gets what they want. When some soldiers start objecting, when they start demanding their share, well, let's just say disagreements in military camps are settled quickly and permanently, with remains left for the local wildlife to clean up. Every day you visit this woman, you try to have normal conversations, talk about life before the war. But you notice her clothes are getting more and more torn. More and more soldiers are taking notice of her presence. You start questioning why you brought her here in the first place. You quietly remove your belt, thinking to yourself that they're all going to die eventually anyway. The orders are clear. Might as well let your fellow soldiers enjoy themselves while they can. You silently walk away from the tent, trying to ignore the sounds coming from inside. The local wolf population keeps growing, getting fatter and healthier by the day. And you know exactly why. Finally, after what feels like an eternity, the army receives orders to move out. On your last visit, the woman looks at you with desperate eyes, tells you that you're a good person, that you're different from the others, begs you to fake her death and let her escape. You nod, tell her you'll help, that you'll find a way, then you swiftly end her life with a single strike. Your greatest strength has always been following orders. It's the only reason you've survived this long in the military. When the command is to leave no survivors, that means complete elimination. Whether it happens today or tomorrow doesn't matter. The mission is clear. Absolutely no one gets left behind. This is the reality of ancient warfare that history books don't want to tell you. Beauty wasn't a blessing, it was a curse. Survival wasn't about luck, it was about understanding that in war, there are no heroes, only people following orders and people who don't make it home. But wait, there's more to this story that'll make your skin crawl. The harsh truth is that throughout history, the most vulnerable always suffered the most. And the system was designed to reward those who could disconnect their humanity from their duty. This wasn't just one story. This was the pattern repeated across centuries, across continents, across every major conflict where armies occupied civilian territories. What makes this even more disturbing is how normalized it became. How soldiers were trained to see this as just another part of conquest. The psychological conditioning required to turn ordinary people into instruments of systematic destruction reveals something terrifying about human nature and the power of authority. Let me tell you something that's going to shock you. This behavior wasn't considered unusual or wrong by the standards of the time. Military leaders actually encouraged it because they knew that giving soldiers these kinds of rewards would make them fight harder, stay loyal longer, and ask fewer questions about the morality of their actions. Think about it from a commander's perspective. You have thousands of men who've been away from home for months, maybe years. Men who've seen their friends die, who've killed strangers with their bare hands, who've been promised glory and riches, but mostly just get exhaustion and trauma. How do you keep them motivated? How do you prevent them from deserting or turning against you? You give them something to look forward to, something that makes all the suffering seem worth it. You create a reward system that feeds into their most basic desires while simultaneously making them complicit in activities that bind them to you through shared guilt and secrecy. The really twisted part is that this wasn't limited to foot soldiers. Officers, generals, even kings participated in and organized these activities. They would divide up the spoils of war, like they were dividing up land or treasure, with the most attractive captives going to the highest-ranking officials. And here's something that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about historical records. Most of the time, these events weren't even recorded as crimes or atrocities. They were just considered normal parts of victory celebrations. The official histories would talk about strategic victories, heroic battles, and conquered territories, but they'd leave out the part about what happened to the people who lived in those territories. You want to know why? Because the people writing those histories were often the same people who participated in or benefited from these activities. They weren't going to record their own crimes for future generations to judge. But here's where it gets really dark, and I mean really dark. The psychological impact on the soldiers themselves was devastating. Many of them would return home completely changed, unable to readjust to civilian life, haunted by what they'd done and what they'd seen. They'd been trained to see other human beings as objects, as rewards, as disposable resources. And that kind of conditioning doesn't just disappear when the war ends. Next time you see a war movie that glorifies ancient battles, remember this story. Remember that behind every conquest, every victory celebration, every territorial expansion, there were countless individuals whose stories were never recorded, whose suffering was never acknowledged, whose humanity was treated as collateral damage in the pursuit of power. The scariest part, this mentality didn't disappear with ancient times. The same psychological mechanisms that enabled these atrocities continue to influence how societies treat vulnerable populations during conflicts even today. Understanding this history isn't just about learning from the past. It's about recognizing patterns that could emerge again if we're not vigilant about protecting human dignity in all circumstances. Modern military training actually includes extensive education about war crimes and the protection of civilians precisely because military leaders learned from history that without proper moral guidance, soldiers can quickly lose their humanity in the chaos of warfare. But even today, we see echoes of these ancient patterns in conflicts around the world. The systematic targeting of civilians, the use of violence as a tool of control, the dehumanization of enemy populations, these aren't just historical curiosities. They're ongoing challenges that require constant vigilance and moral courage to prevent. The lesson here isn't that all soldiers are monsters or that all wars are inherently evil. The lesson is that power without accountability, authority without moral constraints, and violence without ethical boundaries can turn ordinary people into perpetrators of unimaginable cruelty. What's truly terrifying is how quickly and easily this transformation can happen. Normal people, with families and communities and moral beliefs, can be conditioned through training, peer pressure, and authority figures to commit acts that would have been unthinkable to them in peacetime. This is why studying history matters, not just to understand what happened, but to understand what could happen again. Every generation faces the choice between protecting the vulnerable and exploiting them, between upholding human dignity and sacrificing it for political or military advantage. The question isn't whether we're capable of these kinds of atrocities. History has already answered that question. The question is whether we're willing to create systems, laws, and cultural norms that prevent them from happening again.